Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot, and today we're looking at the latest update to the Fenix Simulations A320 for Microsoft Flight Simulator. This is a high fidelity A320 simulation. It's been an absolute joy to use on the channel, and I know a lot of you have been enjoying it as well. I was on the beta and alpha team for this, although I was not able to be a part as much of the testing of this update due to being quite busy at the moment, but it is now here. It is available for everyone, so if you have the Fenix Simulations A320, you can now update it to version 1.0.3 and then it's 0.125. So this is sort of the third update. It's the biggest update we've seen for the Fenix Simulations A320. It's been a little while since we've had an update for it, so I know a lot of people were very excited to hear about this one and see what it involved, and it is now here and it involves a lot of things. We are going to see changes to the handling, we're seeing changes to the computations, to the graphics, to the so many things, more things than I'm going to be able to cover in the video. So of course the changelog will be available on the Fenix app if you want to see what they've changed, and Amir has done a great post on the Fenix Discord explaining it. But what we're going to look at today is the bits that interest me and that caught my eye, and we'll take as usual a bit of a comparison to the real world and give you a bit of extra context on some of those changes and to give you my thoughts on them. So that's what we're going to be covering in today's video. As ever, I am a real-world Airbus pilot, but none of this is for any real-world use. It's just to give you some extra context on your home simulations. We're going to do a short flight from here in Aberdeen. We're going to head down to Glasgow, so a very short flight, but it's going to allow us to put the Fenix through its paces with some of these latest updates and get an idea of what has changed. Before we do get started, I'd just like to remind you of our partnership with Apex Gaming PCs, where we have a line of custom 320 SimPilot PCs that you can also customize yourself on the website. If you do buy one, you'll be supporting the channel, and you can get a 5% discount with the code 320 SimPilot. First, let's look at a couple of the external model changes. So, something, by the way, I absolutely love still on this model is this different metal texturing on the wing. Look at that, just great. So the lights have been slightly reworked in the synchronization of them, thanks to some help from the fly-by-wire team. So yeah, that was a nice little note in the changelog. But as you can see here, there is now slightly brighter on the splash puddles, I think they called them. So if we set it to night, you'll see that the nav lights and strobe lights are a little bit brighter, which is definitely more representative of the real aircraft. The strobe lights are very noticeable out underneath the wings, and at night when you're taxiing around, as you line up on the runway, when you look over your shoulder, you can see the strobe lights very clearly lighting up the floor. They are quite bright, and as are the nav lights on the aircraft. These lights are obviously designed to be seen from many miles away, so yeah, pretty good, pretty nice update. I don't know, they don't look quite as bright as that, I wouldn't say, on the actual wing, but that perhaps is a limitation of having the proper effect on the ground. So maybe the nav light's a little bit bright now, but the strobe lights certainly are looking really nice indeed, very effective. So that's nice to see. If we move around to the tail, let me just give us a bit of light. Another thing that's been changed now is the horizontal stabilizer works. So you can see here that it is sitting at see on the other side actually, it should be at the neutral position. There it is, the 0 is slightly hidden on this livery, but yeah, there is a 0 indices sort of marker on the tail. Something that you'll notice on all Airbuses, and this is something that has been missing from the Fenix, is that this, as far as I'm aware, this stabilizer wasn't moving, the horizontal stabilizer, or certainly wasn't moving correctly. It's always set to 0 after landing in the A320. So as the aircraft rolls out on the runway, you'll see the trim wheel in the flight deck running forwards, typically, but depending how the trim was, I suppose. But it runs and resets itself to 0. So the aircraft taxis in, parks up, and shuts down and spends a turnaround with the stabilizer at 0. So every walk around you do, it should also be at 0. It's very unusual if it's not. I have had it where it isn't due to strange situations, such as if you started your engine, set the trim, and then shut down again or something like that. So that really stands out. So it was noticeable to me that this wasn't actually at 0 all the time. But yeah, now it does adjust. So if I'll have to jump out of the drone mode, but then we can run the trimmer, wind the nose way up. So this is going for nose up, so I'm expecting to see that the front of that stabilizer to lower and be below the 0 marker. So we're now outside of the green band, which means we're no longer in the takeoff range, and there we go. Now you can see it's sitting low. So if you saw this, yeah, well, you wouldn't. It would reset. There's probably something else going on with the aircraft. Of course, when they taxi out, the stabilizer trim would have been set by the flight crew. so it will be in whatever position it needs to be for takeoff. It's a noticeable difference between the A320 and the Boeings. On the Boeing, it doesn't seem to recenter on most of them. I don't know what it does do, but you will often see Boeing aircraft parked up on the turnaround with their stabilizers set to all different manner of trims compared to the Airbus, where it's at 0. But there we go. So little details, but this is like I said earlier, there is a huge list of changes, and I'm barely going to scratch the surface, but I'm just talking about some of the ones I've noticed and thought would be nice to show you and talk about. So here we are on the flight deck, and you'll notice that if I recenter my view, this is the new default position, which is really handy. This now lets you see the PFD and the ND and the engine display all at once, just straight from default. So if you're looking around and then you recenter, they're all there. This is a nice change. I think before they were cut off slightly at the bottom, so you always had to recenter it down. Just a small detail, but it all adds up, so that's nice to see. I'm not entirely convinced. To me, this seat position feels ever so slightly too high, so I feel like I'm high and looking down a bit too much. However, it's very hard to judge in the simulator, so I'm going to experiment a bit myself and see if there's a seating position I prefer. But still, the magic is that now you do get this clear view of the screens and the PFD on approach. Because if you go to the landing view, then that's just ridiculous. Yeah, that's way too high now. But that's a Microsoft Flight Simulator thing, not a Fenix thing. So much nicer view. The screens included straight away, but I might see if I can experiment and find one I prefer as time goes on. Of course, needless to say that seat position is also going to be a very much a preference-based thing. To align your seat position, you look over here at these markers, and then as you move up and down and left and right, you can see that white ball behind becomes visible. So it should be blocked out. But if you're sitting too high, it will also still be blocked out. So the way to do it is to actually start too low and then raise the seat until the white ball just disappears. Yeah, some pilots will like it in a slightly different position to others, and as long as it's within a reasonable range, then that's absolutely fine. That's what works for them. But it's I find being slightly on the lower side tends to be a little bit more helpful for me, but that could be different for somebody else. Also adjusted now are the click spots. So they weren't bad before, but they've been improved. So now you can see, for example, the landing lights, put it in the middle, and you can set them both to on. And obviously same for things like the strobe and so on. So they, as I said, not bad before, but now modified and definitely in a better position, sitting in this default view. So very nice indeed. There's also been a lot of work done to the stability of the EFB, as well as getting the panel states sorted, it seems. So now there's some cleaning up of these cold and dark and turn around with APU panel states. I'm not going to flick through them all here. We've used them before, but little things like the clock used to be running and so on when it shouldn't. So they've been neatened up, and then the switches should be in the correct position. There's more to that update than I can actually fully understand at the moment or appreciate. So that's going to be something we'll revisit in the future on streams. But yeah, I already thought the panel states was very good, but it's just been sharpened up even further, which is nice to see. Last thing we'll talk about before we get going is just the nose-wheel steering tiller. So I don't use a separate axis for the tiller. I don't have it assigned in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So what I've been using is the option to let's just take the brake off. Oh, by the way, that animation's been changed as well. Gives that little lift up, because you do have to lift the parking brake in the real Airbus. So yeah, nice little animation there. But what I previously have been doing, and I'm just going to do a very short bit of taxiing here, is just using the rudder and then allowing it to do the nose-wheel steering for me. So as we get moving now, you'll see that it does run the nose-wheel steering just by using the rudder, which is absolutely fine, and I find it quite practical. But what they've done now is, you'll see down here on the flight control page, the rudder is actually moving, and you can see it outside as well, which is, you don't see airliners taxiing around with the rudder moving, and there's a reason for that, and that is simply that on the ground we use the nose-wheel steering tiller. So if you have a tiller assigned, I don't think there's any change. You can leave it as it is, and you can have it assigned in Microsoft Flight Simulator. But what you can do now, if you're in my position, is you can actually press the pedal disconnect button and then just use your feet, and below 20 knots is going to just run it as if you're using the tiller. Now you can see that I've got full turn and the rudder is sitting neutral. So this is a nice realism update, as it were. This is more what you expect to see airliners doing. So that's very nice. It doesn't mean you can do your flight control checks realistically, even so, because of course I can move my joystick and get full deflection on the flight controls, But yeah, now I have no way to do my rudder because of course it's disconnected. So if you press the disconnect again and it releases, then you're back to the normal situation and the rudder sort of moves. So a nice little update, and particularly good for those of you who enjoy making it look as realistic as possible. But yeah, there we go. Of course, for ultimate realism, having a tiller axis is going to be the way forward, and that way you can avoid all of this sort of just doing the best we can sort of thing. But still, a nice little feature, I think, and now we have a use for that pedal disconnect button. Something I'd like to point out is that that is not representative of what that button does in the real aircraft. So, and it's quite important, I think, to point this out. Pedal disconnect is used only for one thing, and that is when we want to move the rudder without moving the nose or steering. So in the real aircraft, this button does not stay down. You press it in and you have to hold it in with the palm of your hand while steering. It does not latch down like it does in the sim. And that's because they're using it for a totally different function than the real aircraft. It's called pedal disconnect because what it does is it disconnects the rudder pedals from the nose wheel steering. That's what it disconnects. So you press it in the real aircraft, and then when you move the rudders, which I can't do anymore, but you press it in, and when you move the rudder pedals, the nose wheel steering will not turn. That way you can do the rudder check without steering the aircraft on the ground. Because remember, on the real aircraft, even with the steering tiller over here, the rudders will actually move the nose wheel a little bit, just a small amount, but that's designed for takeoff. When you're at low speed, you need a bit of nose wheel steering still before the flight controls become effective. So all we do with this button in real life is when we do the flight control checks, you'll push it in and hold it down, check your rudders on here, and you can do that while moving because you won't affect the steering, and then release it. And whilst that's pressed in, the tiller will still work like normal, but it takes a brave person to press that button, turn the aircraft with the tiller, and do the flight control checks. Some people do, but yeah, it takes a bit of coordination. So there we go. So that is the change to the tiller. So let's get into the air and talk about a few other things. Now, there's been some big changes to the sound. The sound model was okay, but it had room for improvement. That was quite a common theme, I think, from people talking to me on the streams and so on, what they thought about it. I always liked it, but yeah, it had room to feel a bit more impressive. So that has been completely reworked to an amazing degree. So we'll let you listen to that very shortly as we get underway. But also, just before we go, I want to mention the rotation. On the previous rotation, remember we're flying an A320 CEO here, current engine option. So this aircraft does not have rotate law like the Neo. So it will not handle like the fly-by-wire A320. In the Neo, you pull the side stick back a certain amount and the aircraft will command that rotation rate and it will keep it there. In the CEO, it's not quite the same as that. It's a bit less fancy. What happens is as you rotate, you're in direct law. So you're just moving that elevator at the back exactly as you would expect to. So you're just directly in control of it like a normal aeroplane. And then after takeoff, over a few seconds, the aircraft will blend into normal law. Now that is quite a complex thing to simulate, and yeah, it was, I thought, handled nicely on the previous version of the Fenix. I liked the way it flew, but there was one little catch to it, which was if you were to rotate the aircraft and then once it was in the air, let go of the side stick for a moment, the nose would actually drop right back down. So they've updated that to improve the handling of it. It does still drop a bit, but not as aggressively as it used to. Now, what I will say is that I wasn't too concerned about that before because you never really do that in the real aircraft. Over the few seconds of rotation, you'll actually hold that side stick input to some extent. You need to, all the way up to the time you reach sort of the required pitch attitude, which the SRS flight directors are commanding. So the reality was, if you were encountering that feature, as it were, you probably were, there was something else wrong with your trim or setup. But anyway, it's nice to see it softened out and improved, and that's going to be a theme, a lot of changes to the flight model and handling, especially near the ground, which we'll talk about once we get underway. So I'm going to turn up the audio now so you can hear the full roar of the engines on takeoff, and then we will talk about some other features on the way down to Glasgow. So hopefully you can hear there some major improvements to the sound. It really roars now. Something else, I let go of the side stick there during that rotation later on in the rotation admittedly, but still the nose didn't drop down like it had been, which is a nice change. They've also adjusted the thrust setting, so you can see I'm still at the flex thrust here of 60 degrees. We are gently accelerating, but the pitch when I had it up high was still not quite as high as it had been before, and the aircraft didn't accelerate as it did before. So before we were finding the Fenix had a bit too much power on takeoff effectively, and now it's been reworked, so it's being a bit more representative of what you would expect, or it's very representative I would say, so very nice. Anyway, autopilot 1. Oh, too much, there we go. Right, thrust climb, autopilot 1, auto thrust. We're above the F, that's the 1. And there we go, we are underway. I've just rewound the time a bit to make sure we have light for the video, and then speed out star. So here's something else that's been done above the S. Let's keep the aircraft climbing actually. 110 thrust climb open climb. So they've adjusted the way it accelerates. So instead of it just lowering the nose to 500 feet per minute, goes flap 0, it now has a more sort of nuanced acceleration, a bit more realistic. Something that the Fenix was doing, let's put in flight level 160 and go to standards. Actually, we'll put it on cruise level of just 220. Something it was doing was being a bit too aggressive at accelerating, lowering the nose too much and maintaining too low a vertical speed. The real aircraft does have a whole formula for how it works these things out, but yeah, it was not quite how you'd expect it to be. So that's been adjusted, which is nice. We're going to see it in particular at flight level 100, where previously it would always go to sort of 500 feet per minute and accelerate, which is not something, as I say, the real aircraft does. So we'll see that shortly. Let's continue with our clean up, so that can go. Use up these new click spots to get some lights off. I'll let the passengers out a bit early as it's a short flight. And there we go, underway. So here we go then, arriving at 10,000 feet. It's going to accelerate to its normal climb speed, not limited. And like I say, previously the nose would drop to sort of 500 feet per minute and it would just stay there. Now it should be a little bit more nuanced as it goes for its acceleration. There we go. The real aircraft balances all sorts of things, so yeah, quite a lot of calculations that go on, but that is a more reasonable expectation. Lowers the nose, but not as aggressively as it had been. So that's nice to see. Small updates, but it all adds up. The amount of updates they've done is really amazing, and it goes into a really ridiculous level of detail. For example, I've done a video on gravity gear extension, which some of you might have seen, and I showed in the Fenix, and I think I showed in a couple of other aircraft as well, a couple of other add-ons. In the Fenix it was quite slow. Well, they've updated that now to be a bit more representative of the real aircraft, where the gravity gear doesn't actually come down that slowly. So yeah, just little details like that, making sure that when certain ADRs are failed that you get flap 1 plus F instead of just flap 1 in the air, which is a feature of the aircraft when it doesn't know the speeds correctly, so it will have to just put the flaps out. Anyway, all sorts of little details like this that it goes on and on, really amazing to see. So there we go, so that is done. They've also adjusted the roll spoiler logic, so what I'm going to do is just take us outside and we'll just disconnect the autopilot. So I'm not entirely sure what was wrong with the roll spoilers. They're not something I look at much when flying, but yeah, the order in which they deploy and the way they deploy has been adjusted. So let's put out the speed brakes. Not something you do in the climb normally, but there we go. Once the speed brakes are out, then of course that's going to affect the way the roll spoilers can be used, and you can see there quite a complicated sort of connection between them. So now we're seeing roll spoilers out here, these 4 outboard spoilers having to adjust and roll and decrease and so on. So this has all been modified to make sure it's representative of the aircraft. Something else that they've done that I can understand is must have been quite a challenge, is that there is now, rather unbelievably, wear on those spoilers as well. So let me go to a view that gives us the best look at them. So there's wear and sort of differences in the way the spoilers behave. So instead of just having them all deploy exactly in sync, they are now ever so slightly out of sync, which is hard to show unless you get the lighting just right, but it's a minor detail. But you'll actually see here that this outboard spoiler is lagging ever so slightly behind the inboard. So let's see if I can just show that. you just get a sense of it just for a second there. Let me just put that wing over again. It's really, really nice, and it's something that you'll see in the replays and so on. I think Amir said he wanted to see this sort of thing in the replays. But yeah, as you raise it up, you see the outboard one lag ever so slightly. Maybe the inboard one is slightly too fast. Yeah, really nice detail. Very hard to show in a video. Yeah, we might see more of that over future streams and replays. Something else that's been done whilst we're here with the autopilot off is the auto thrust disconnect buttons can now be mapped. They can be mapped to the auto throttle disconnect coding or keybind in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Previously you were just using auto throttle arm, which was not right, so this is now the correct one. So I've mapped it to my 2 red buttons on my Thrustmaster TCA, and now I can move that to detent, and then I can press the button and it would just turn off the auto thrust. The reason this is better is it turns it off in the correct way. It gives you just that soft ECAM warning, and that's it. It's not even a warning, it's just sort of a notification that goes away, as opposed to the tripping it off or the auto throttle arm, which was using this button, which you'll see the Fenix done a great job here. If I press that one, we actually get the full ECAM, because it's not the correct way to disconnect the auto throttle. It is a way to do it, but the proper way is by pressing the red button, and then you just get that little message. The fact that there's a difference between them shows the level of detail we're working at here with the Fenix, which is great. But of course, it does mean that we wanted, people wanted that assigned correctly, which has worked really nicely. So here we are in the cruise now, fairly shortly beginning our descent in towards Glasgow. Planning to fly our descent from our, here we go, top of descent arrow, pretty much just sort of straight in arrival round to the ILS-05, landing with a bit of a tailwind. And then we have some speed restrictions and altitude restrictions, flight level 90, 230 knots. So VNAV has been completely reworked, which is really impressive. It's a huge task. I talked about this in VNAV videos before, but there's so many things it has to take into account. Predicted winds, temperature changes. It doesn't know whether you're going to use the ice or not. Let's just reinsert those winds, make sure that does all go in. So these things, any variation on that, and the aircraft will not be able to stick exactly to its planned speeds. Also, we have limits here. Actually, let's cancel that, because it already had one in before we delete it by accident. So as you can see, if we need to be at foil, it's got 90 as a limit. It wants us to altitude constrain flight level 90 at 230 knots. That can make it tricky, of course, to make other restrictions, and the aircraft will warn you. And the Fenix will indeed warn you if it thinks there's a too steep path ahead. It gives you the message in between the waypoints if it doesn't think it can do it, things like that. But what was happening on the Fenix before, and this was a relatively common, this in fact happened most times I flew it on stream, is that once you start your managed descent, and I have that in other videos where I talk about the descent modes of the Airbus, but in managed descent there's a speed bracket, so it targets a certain speed according to the restrictions as well, but when it's targeting a speed it can be a bit above or a bit below, and it will adjust itself to fly within that range whilst keeping the engines at idle. The idea being this is more efficient than trying to target the speed perfectly. However, the Fenix was always sitting at the bottom of this bracket. It was getting slow, which tells us that the airplane had probably a bit too much drag in the descent. So that was meaning that it actually could slow down a bit. It needed to try and reduce the drag by slowing down to maintain the profile. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the aircraft descend on its own to flight level 100. I'm going to put it into managed descent. I've stuck in the ILS-05 and we've put in the arrival weather as well with a bit of a tailwind, like I said. And there we go, DES, we've got out blue, flight level 100. And down it goes. So here's that speed bracket I was talking about. So what I'm looking for is, in the real Airbus, it typically sits around the middle and often ends up going a bit fast, especially if you do something like use engine anti-ice. So we're slightly below profile now, so what I want to see is, there we go, so it's gone into its descent speed, it's going to reduce that now, and here's our VDEV scale. So it should maintain this green donut, which is going to descend. It should maintain that while staying within this speed range, as opposed to getting to the bottom of it all the time, which it could do quite reliably on the old Fenix. So this has been modified, which is great. So it should vary a bit more now and not just sit at the bottom, but sometimes the middle, sometimes slower, sometimes fast, which is true of the real aircraft. It's not perfect. VNAV stuff is not perfect. Every knot of wind makes a difference. Every temperature change makes a difference. Like I say, putting the engine anti-ice on makes a difference. So we're commanding thrust idle 37.1. Put the engine anti-ice on, and there you go. The M1 has to increase because, of course, we are taking more demand from the engine, so they can't sit quite as slow, and now you're going to sit at the top of the bracket. So let's turn that off. Let's help it out a bit. So you can see it's actually sitting fast this time, which is a good sign. But like I say, that's because it started from a slightly fast position. Let's go to a wing view. Let's check out this speed brakes deploying. Now they deploy quite slowly in this case, so you get them performing pretty much the same. So that's pretty much what you'd expect. But yeah, I can't wait to try and use them more for the landings to see the differences in their deployment. Such a great model anyway. It was already top notch, of course, but these little details are just fantastic. So there we go, I've used the speed brakes, got it back into a normal sort of energy range. Let's see what happens now. But the good news is it hasn't gone straight to the bottom, so yeah, big tick, great to see. Little details, and probably the most important thing from this update is now you can move the seats. And of course you can't just click and drag the seat, you actually have to move the little switches, which is just great. These are used a lot by pilots because finding the perfect seat position, as we talked about earlier, is a big deal. Everyone has their preference, and I can promise you every pilot on approach shuffles their seat. It's so normal. You'll move the seat throughout flight if you want to get a better view down. I quite like to raise my seat slightly during the cruise or the climb stage, because during the climb you can't see much out the windows when the nose is pointing up in the air, so I find it handy to have a bit of a better overview. But yeah, there you go. So these slide up and down, left and right, which is great, just like the real aircraft. And if you go all the way back, it should, I wonder if it does, there it goes off to the side, because of course the Airbus is lovely in ergonomics. So now you can just walk through here and then take your seat. Just brilliant, just what you want. Really handy to avoid smashing your shins on sharp metal bits around the pedestal when the seat does that. So yeah, a great little detail, of course. If these brake, by the way, the motor brakes in the real aircraft, that's what these levers are for. You can adjust the seat manually, and the tilting of the back is done with these levers here. But there we go, that's how you do it. The only thing I'd say is that it's incredibly loud. The seats are very loud, so I wonder if that volume could be turned up a bit. Not sure if it has a sound effect at the moment or not, actually, but yeah, there you go. So you'll often, if you ever, not that we can anymore, but yeah, if you were observing pilots on the flight deck on approach, you'd see the pilot flying inevitably start fiddling with their seat position, because of course we're convinced that that matters a lot to us and the smoothness of our landings. When you're flying now as well, you'll see the heat blur is gone from the back of the engines, so that it doesn't have that sort of low speed heat effect that was coming out from before. So that's better. I'd still like to see, we've seen the Fenix has an excellent contrail effect, so I wonder if there's a nice effect we can have for the jet blast in the cruise, because of course the engines do produce a heat blur to some extent, but the slow style one just wasn't really suitable. X Plane 12 has come along and shown us what heat blur can be. I think that has the best heat blur out the back of the engines in a simulator at the moment in X Plane 12. That's very nice. So I'd like to see something like that put into Microsoft Flight Simulator for sure. Next, I'd like to talk about the approach idle. So this has been talked about in the update and the change log. So what's it referring to? Well, the aircraft in flight can idle the engines at a suitable point to be low on fuel flow and to provide the correct amount of thrust and drag and so on. However, that point is I'm just going to level off for a second here so I can make this point, but that idle point is actually increased when you're on approach, and by approach we're talking about final approach as you come down the ILS or something like that. So why is that? Well, the point is, if you go around on an approach from a low speed state with a lot of drag, so you've got gear and flap out, if the engines were at idle, and they might be, for example, let's say you were holding a higher speed like 170 knots and then you idle the thrust with the gear and flap out, if you then decide to go around, the engines would take a long time to spool up from that low, slow idle point. So what the aircraft does is, when it knows you're on approach and you've got flap and things out, it actually increases the idle point of the engine, so they can't idle as slow as they would otherwise, such as on the ground. There's a different ground idle point and a flight idle point and an approach idle point. So the aircraft does all this for us. We don't actually have to think about it. But some people were saying in the Fenix that it was taking too long for the engines to spool up in order to fly the go-around. So what's been done is that approach idle point has been added in. It's just proof of how good the model was originally, that was noticed, because that proved that what was missing was not that the spool up time was wrong, because it does take a while to spool up these engines, but actually that the approach idle was missing. So that is now in there, which is great. Now, you're not going to notice this, or you shouldn't notice this, if you do a go-around from a normal configuration with the thrust up at a normal point. It's only if you were at idle thrust for any reason, like I say, if you had idled the engines on approach because you were very fast or something like that, and then you tried to go around as the aircraft got slow. Or most likely the time you'd see this is in a bulk landing situation. And by that I mean if you go around from having idled the engines on the runway. So you're in the flare, you've then idled the engines, they're coming back to idle, and then you decide you want to go around. So which is something you can do in the real aircraft, of course, but if you do that, the engines may have slowed down quite a lot. But now they'll only slow down to approach idle point, as opposed to slowing down to the old idle point, which was too slow and it was taking too long for them to spool up. I hope that makes sense. Let me just give you a bit of a demonstration. So if I now put the aircraft into thrust idle open descent, I'm going to put 3,000 feet in the window, and we can watch them spool all the way down. Okay, quite close to the terrain doing this, but there we go. Down, 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 down. And you'll see we're below flap 1 speed, so I'm going to put it at flap 1. But there we go, there's the idle point on the M1s, it's about 27.2. We'll go to flap 1, and you'll see the idle point has increased. So the aircraft now is on approach idle mode. It's keeping the engines at a higher thrust, more ready for a go around should we need it. So again, nice to see. Something else that's been changed is flap 2 is less draggy. So lots of lifts and flight model handling changes in the way the aircraft handles in the flare and with the flaps and so on. And also the way the roll stability works, lots and lots of changes. But flap 2 before could get you out of anything. Now I'm pretty high here. I'm at, what am I at, 4,700 feet, 9 miles out, so doable. But I'm going to need flap 2 to try and get some of this energy out of the airplane. So I'm going to look at that and go flap 2. And now I'm going to pull the speeds at about 180 knots. And I would expect a reasonable rate of descent, but nothing too crazy. It would do sort of probably about 1,000 to 1,500 feet per minute, I would expect in this situation, as it sort of stabilizes. There we go, 1,200 feet per minute. Speed started to increase again. Yeah, really nice. Before, this was giving us too much drag, and it was possible to solve any problem with it. But flap 2 is handy, but the real way to solve problems from here, if you were really high, would be to use the speed brakes and gear as well if you needed to. But often flap 2 is all you need. So there we go. And actually we're going to go through the center line here and intercept from the other side. But yeah, nice to see again an improvement to that handling. Now the Airbus is very good at capturing. I wonder if it's going to do this. There we go, Speed Glide Star Lockstar. It's one of the more impressive aircraft I've ever flown for its ability to capture a localizer from any ludicrous angle you give it. You have to monitor very closely, and this is not something we would normally do. But still, it's the Airbus. I wouldn't be surprised if the real aircraft would do this as well. The reason you wouldn't do this is because now you can see we're actually off the localizer to the right. So we're way out to the right, which means we can't actually descend with the glide slope because we're not on the localizer. But what the aircraft is going to do is it's going to carry on with that glide slope because you can see it has captured the glide slope mode. So this is not a bug, by the way, or even a change. This is just something I'm just talking about because I happen to have put the aircraft in this position and for this video. But there we go. So now it's going to find its way back over. But yeah, you can't descend with that glide slope until you are within range on the localizer. It will be soon, but still.
2,500.
There we go, there's the radio altimeter coming to life. Bit of a higher terrain beneath us here. So now that we have the approach idle, yeah, you can see 34.5 is where it's sitting on idle. And that combined with the better ratio of drag on the flaps, working out nicely to feel a bit more representative on the approach stage of things. And there's our localizer coming in. Here we are on final then with a bit of a crosswind from the right. So they've updated the flare. It now feels a bit different to before. I think it's fairly similar, but it has changed slightly. So again, I'll take a bit more time to see what I think about that. But something that has also been improved is the rudder authority. Landing in a crosswind with the Fenix before was notoriously difficult due to the lateral control once the main gear was on the ground and the nose gear was still in the air. That's been improved now, so you do have the rudder authority you need to keep the aircraft where you want it. Landing in a crosswind in the Airbus I have done videos on before, but essentially you put in the rudder to remove the drift just before touchdown, and when you do that you need to hold that rudder after touchdown in order to keep the airplane from drifting off the centre line. So autopilot off, and let's have a go now. So we got about 15 knots on the right, not a lot of crosswind, but still I was hoping it'd be a bit more, but my settings are obviously not quite right.
40,
Into the
30,
flare at 30,
20, retard,
idle,
10,
and now squeezing off the drift. And you can see it's hard
10,
to judge the height.
5,
There's touchdown, bit of a bounce there, and there's it settling in. Hard to judge the height, I think, with the camera position slightly higher, but there we go. Spoilers, reverse green, decel, and I'm barely using the rudder there to keep it on the centre line. So lateral control much improved, but that flare slightly changed now. So we're going to take a bit of readjustment, and I'm going to fine tune my controls a bit and see if I can get it back to exactly where I like it. But yeah, it's still a very, as I think Amir put it, familiar aircraft in that sense, just with the extra ability to control that yaw in the crosswinds, which is what we were looking for. So this landing would have been a go around in real life because of the bounce out of the touchdown zone, the little skip there. The bounce was not unreasonable, but it does take you past the touchdown zone. What's interesting here is that you can see the ground spoilers deploy, and then once we go back in the air, they actually deflect down to the flight position, and then they go back into the ground position again. Quite fun to see them manoeuvring between the two positions there, so I thought I'd leave it in the video. But yeah, as you can see, they deploy at different speeds now, which is a really nice detail. So there we are, that's all for today's video. Like I said, barely scratching the surface of all the many updates that have been done. The changelog is available, of course, for this version of the Fenix Simulations A320. But hopefully it's given you a bit of an insight into some of the changes that have been made and some of the differences. A lot of the handling things are hard for me to show in a video, and it depends on your control setup, and that's things that I'll be trying out in the future. I don't want to give any definite sort of best recommended response curves and things like that at this stage. That's something we'll need a bit of time to get used to, as always when things change with these aircraft. But lots of great updates here. We've got the rudder authority we were looking for, and the VNAV has been behaving in a bit more of a realistic fashion, which is great to see. And yeah, just this icing on the cake when it comes to things like the spoilers deploying individually and so on. Very nice indeed. So there'll be plenty more videos, tutorials and guides coming for the Fenix A320, as well as other Airbus simulations, and of course there'll be plenty of live streams in these aircraft and others, so do please subscribe if you'd like to see more of those. That's all then. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you again in another video or live stream soon. Bye bye.